The dress was already hanging on the back of my closet door, still zipped in its garment bag, when I picked up his phone by mistake instead of mine. Same case, same crack in the corner. I didn't even think twice grabbing it off the nightstand. That's the only reason I saw the message at all. I can't stop thinking about last night. We need to talk before Saturday. Saturday was my wedding day, 6 days away. And the name at the top of the thread was Emily, my best friend since sophomore year of college, my maid of honor, the woman who was supposed to be standing next to me at the altar holding my flowers. I sat down on the edge of the bed and read it 3 times before my brain would even let the words mean what they meant. Let me back up, because I think you need to understand how much I trusted both of these people before I tell you the rest. I'm not going to use real names here, obviously, but I'll call him Daniel and her Emily, because that's close enough to how it felt, like 2 people I thought I knew completely turned out to be strangers wearing very familiar faces. Daniel and I met 3 years ago through mutual friends at a barbecue neither of us really wanted to attend. We ended up talking by the cooler for 2 hours and missed most of the actual party. He was funny in a dry, understated way, the kind of funny that sneaks up on you a beat after he says something. He remembered small details about my life, my sister's kid's name, the fact that I hated cilantro, the anniversary of my dad's passing, and he never made a big show of remembering them. He just did. I fell for him slowly and then all at once, the way you're supposed to. Or at least the way every romantic comedy tells you that you're supposed to. Emily and I had been close for almost a decade by that point. We'd been roommates junior year, bridesmaids in each other's earlier relationships that didn't work out, the kind of friends who could go 2 months without talking and pick back up mid-sentence. When Daniel proposed, Emily was the first person I called, still crying, still holding out my hand to look at the ring even though she was on speakerphone and couldn't see it. She screamed so loud my ears rang. She cried harder than I did. If I'm honest, I remember thinking, at the time, how lucky I was that the 2 most important people in my life loved each other too. Daniel thought Emily was hilarious. Emily thought Daniel was exactly the grounded, steady type she'd always said I needed. Planning the wedding pulled the 3 of us together constantly. Emily helped me pick the venue. She sat through 4 dress fittings, vetoed 2 centerpiece designs, cried again when I found the one. Daniel and Emily started coordinating logistics between themselves sometimes. The bachelor and bachelorette weekends overlapped in one city, so there was a shared group chat, shared vendors, shared everything. I thought it was efficient. I thought it was sweet, even, that my fiancé and my best friend got along well enough to plan things without me having to referee. Looking back now, there were small things. Emily got quieter around me in the last 2 months before the wedding. In a way I chalked up to her own stuff. She'd gone through a rough breakup that spring, and I assumed watching me plan a wedding was just harder for her than she wanted to admit. Daniel started taking his phone into the bathroom with him, which I noticed and then talked myself out of noticing, the way you do. And at my bridal shower, when Emily gave her toast, there was a moment, just a flicker, where her voice caught on something that wasn't tears of joy. I remember thinking she seemed nervous giving a speech in front of people. I didn't think anything else of it. Why would I have? I think about the engagement photos we took that spring, too. Emily had come along to help with hair and makeup touch-ups between locations, and there's a shot my photographer caught, completely by accident, of Emily standing just behind Daniel while I pose for a solo shot. She's looking at him, not at me, not at the camera, just at him, with an expression I didn't have a name for at the time. I saw that photo in the proofs gallery months later and scrolled right past it. I wonder now how many other moments like that existed in plain sight, waiting for me to actually look at them instead of just filing them under fine. There was also the matter of the group chat. Daniel and Emily had started messaging each other directly more, apparently to coordinate logistics without looping me in on every small decision, which vendor to call back, which hotel block to finalize. At the time I thought it was thoughtful, sparing me the mental load. I didn't consider, not once, that a private line of communication between the 2 people closest to me might be used for anything other than wedding planning. 6 days before the wedding, I picked up the wrong phone off the nightstand. and every one of those small things rearranged itself into a different picture entirely. I didn't confront him right away. I want to be honest about that because I think it's the part of this story people relate to most, the strange, cold clarity that takes over instead of the explosion you'd expect. I sat there with his phone, and instead of shaking, instead of crying, I felt this eerie calm settle over me, like my body had decided we weren't doing panic yet. We were doing information gathering first. I scrolled up. The thread went back further than I wanted it to. 5 weeks, at least, though the earliest messages had clearly been deleted because the conversation just started mid-sentence with Emily saying we can't keep doing this and pretending it's nothing. 5 weeks meant this had been happening since before the bachelorette trip. Since before Emily helped me try on my dress for the final fitting and told me I looked like the happiest bride she'd ever seen. I had no idea the worst part was still ahead of me. I put the phone down, exactly where it had been, screen side down, and I went into the bathroom and locked the door and sat on the edge of the tub for 20 minutes doing math I didn't want to do. 5 weeks. The bachelorette trip had been 4 weeks ago, which meant whatever this was had started before that trip, which meant Emily had spent an entire weekend with my closest friends, toasting my engagement, doing a shot to the happiest couple I know, while already deep in whatever this thread represented. When Daniel got home from work that night, I didn't say anything. I know how that sounds, but I needed one more day to understand what I was dealing with before I let myself feel it, because some instinct told me that once I said the words out loud, there'd be no controlling what happened next, and I wanted to walk into that with a plan instead of just raw wreckage. That night, lying next to him in the dark, I ran through every interaction I could remember from the past 5 weeks, searching for the moments I must have missed. The night he said he was staying late at the office and came home smelling faintly like a different detergent than ours. The Saturday he canceled our cake tasting for a client emergency and rescheduled it for the following week, the same week I now knew Emily had also mysteriously been out of town. Small, deniable things. The kind of things you only see clearly once you already know what you're looking for. The next morning, I did something I'm not proud of and don't regret. I went through his email, which I had access to from years ago when I'd helped him set up a shared calendar for a trip we took. I found a receipt buried in there, a hotel 40 minutes outside the city, dated the Tuesday after the bachelorette trip, booked for one night, a single room. I didn't need to guess who else had been there. Emily had posted a story that same day, blurry and vague, captioned much needed reset, geotagged nowhere near where she claimed to be spending the week. That was the moment the calm cracked, not into tease, into something sharper, more focused. I remember standing in my kitchen holding my phone, staring at that hotel receipt, and thinking with a strange, clinical detachment. Okay, now I know exactly what I'm dealing with. Now I decide what happens next. Not them. I called my sister first, not Daniel, not Emily. I needed one person in my corner who had zero stake in either of them staying likable. She drove over within the hour, and when I showed her the messages, she didn't gasp or perform shock the way I think I expected her to. She just said, very quietly, okay, what do you want to do? Not what should we do, or what are you going to say to him? What do you want? It was the first time in the entire process that anyone had centered the question on me instead of on managing the fallout. We sat on my kitchen floor for almost 2 hours that afternoon, going through every message, every date, every deleted and restored fragment I could reconstruct. My sister has always been the practical one in our family, the one who makes lists when everyone else is spiraling, and I watched her switch almost instantly from horrified sister to strategist, asking me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself yet. Had I told anyone else? Was the venue payment fully refundable or partially? Did I want Daniel out of the apartment before or after I confronted him? Each question forced me to think one step further ahead than my grief wanted to let me go, and by the end of those 2 hours, I had something I hadn't had that morning, an actual plan instead of just a wound. I decided I wasn't going to give either of them the confrontation they might be bracing for, some tearful, screaming scene where I lost my composure and they got to comfort each other about how badly they'd hurt me. I decided I was going to do this on my terms, calmly, with everything already lined up, so that by the time either of them realized I knew, there was nothing left for them to spin. I spent the next 2 days quietly unwinding my own wedding. I called the venue and put a hold on the final payment, citing a family emergency, which wasn't even a lie. I called my day of coordinator and asked her, privately, to have a backup plan ready in case my maid of honor wasn't available. I didn't explain further. And to her credit, she didn't ask. I reached out to 2 other close friends, women who'd been in my life longer than either Daniel or Emily, and told them, carefully, what I'd found. Both of them, it turned out, had noticed something was off with Emily in recent weeks and had said nothing because they didn't want to plant seeds of doubt before my wedding. I understood that instinct. I wished, quietly, that just one of them had planted the seed anyway. During those 2 days, I also went quietly through our shared finances, something I'd never had reason to scrutinize before. I found nothing damning there, at least, no joint money spent on hotels or gifts I hadn't authorized, which I remember being almost strangely grateful for, like it was the one small mercy in an otherwise devastating week. I also reached out to a divorce attorney a mutual friend had recommended years earlier for an unrelated reason, just to understand, hypothetically, what walking away from a shared lease and joint vendor contracts would actually look like. It felt absurd making that call for a wedding that hadn't even happened yet, but it also felt like exactly the kind of unglamorous, practical groundwork nobody tells you you'll need. 4 days before the wedding, I sat Daniel down at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd once spread out seating charts and told him which of his cousins couldn't sit near which other cousins, and I put his phone down in front of him, screenshots already open. I remember the specific quality of the light in that kitchen that afternoon, low and orange through the window, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it deserved to look. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming, the ring on my finger feeling suddenly heavier than it had that morning, like it already knew what was coming before I said a word. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just slid the phone across the table and watched his face change in real time as he understood exactly how much I already knew. He didn't lie, not at first. He put his head in his hands the way people do when they know the performance is over, and he said the line I think every person in this position says, "It's not what you think. It's always exactly what you think." He told me it had just happened during the Bachelorette overlap weekend, that he and Emily had ended up alone at a bar one night when their respective groups had splintered off, that one thing led to another and neither of them had meant for it to keep going. I asked him if he loved her. He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything the words that followed couldn't undo, no matter how many times he said he loved me, that this was a mistake, that we could fix this. I want to slow down on this part, because it's the moment everything actually shifted in me. Sitting across from him, watching him search his own face for an answer about a woman who wasn't me, 6 days before I was supposed to promise him forever in front of 120 people, I felt something close, quietly, somewhere behind my ribs. Not dramatically, just a door shutting. I told him the wedding was off. He asked if we could talk it through first, if I could sleep on it. I told him I'd already slept on it for 2 nights while he had no idea I knew, and that decision had been made the moment I read that hotel receipt, not just now. He tried a few more times over the following 2 days before I finally asked him to move his things out. He brought up how long we'd been together, how much we'd built, how one mistake shouldn't erase 3 years. I remember telling him that if it had actually been one mistake, one drunken lapse he'd confessed to me himself in a moment of guilt, I might have believed there was something to talk through. But this wasn't one mistake. This was 5 weeks of a relationship he'd maintained in parallel with our engagement, hidden carefully enough that I'd only found it by accident. There's a difference between falling once and building an entire second life quietly next to the first one, and I needed him to understand I could see that difference clearly even if he was still working hard not to. Emily, for her part, tried calling me 11 times over the next 24 hours. I didn't answer any of them. I let her sit exactly where I'd been sitting for the past 4 days, not knowing what I knew, not knowing what was coming. just waiting. Instead, I sent her a single text. I know about the hotel. Don't call again. She showed up at my apartment an hour later anyway, mascara already streaked, saying she could explain that it wasn't supposed to happen, that she'd hated herself every single day since. I let her stand on my porch and say all of it, the whole tangled explanation about how it started as just talking during a hard time in her life, how she told herself it would stop before the wedding, how she genuinely, truly loved me and hated herself for what she'd done. I listened to every word without interrupting, partly out of some morbid curiosity about what justification she'd land on, and partly because I think some part of me needed to hear her actually say it out loud, in her own voice, rather than just reading it in a string of text messages. When she finished, I asked her one question. Did you feel anything at all, helping me pick my dress, knowing what you were doing? She didn't have an answer. Her mouth opened and closed twice, and nothing came out, which was somehow more damning than any excuse could have been. I closed the door. Canceling a wedding 6 days out is its own strange kind of chaos, almost clinical in how much logistics crowds out the grief. I spent that week on the phone with vendors, most of whom were kind about it in ways that genuinely surprised me. My florist refunded half my deposit unprompted when I told her what happened. No bride should pay full price for that kind of week, she said. My mother, who I'd worried would be devastated about the money and the guest list and the invitations already mailed, said only one thing that mattered. Thank God you found out now instead of during the honeymoon. The photographer took it hardest, oddly, calling me twice just to check in even though there was nothing left for her to do. The DJ offered, unprompted, to hold my deposit as credit for a future event with no expiration date, for whenever you're ready for a party that's actually worth celebrating, he said, which made me laugh for the first time in days, a real laugh, not the brittle kind I'd been forcing for my mother's sake. The hardest calls were to the guests, especially the ones flying in from out of state. I didn't go into detail with most people, just the wedding's off. I'll explain when I'm ready. But a few close family members got the real version, and I noticed something interesting happen as the news spread. People started quietly telling me things they'd noticed and never mentioned. An aunt who'd seen Daniel and Emily's heads bent close together at the rehearsal dinner planning meeting and thought nothing of it until now. A cousin who'd overheard Emily on the phone during the bachelorette trip, using a tone she now recognized as guilty rather than casual. Nobody had lied to protect them exactly. They just hadn't had the full picture any more than I had. One conversation stayed with me longer than the others. My grandmother, 83 years old and blunter than anyone else in my family, listened to the whole story over the phone without interrupting once. When I finished, she said simply, "Better a canceled wedding than a canceled life." I didn't fully appreciate that line until months later, but I think about it often now. I did go through with one thing that week, and it's the part of this story I'm proudest of. I'd already paid, in full, for a long weekend at the resort where the honeymoon was supposed to happen. Non-refundable. Instead of eating that cost or handing it to Daniel out of some misplaced guilt, I called my sister and my 2 other closest friends and told them to pack a bag. 4 days after my wedding was supposed to happen, I was on a beach with the 3 women who actually deserved the title of person who shows up for me, toasting nothing in particular except the fact that I'd found out the truth before I said I do instead of after. That trip ended up being one of the strangest, most healing weekends of my life. We didn't talk about Daniel or Emily much. Actually, mostly we just existed, ate too much seafood, fell asleep on the beach in the middle of the afternoon, laughed at things that weren't even that funny in the particular, slightly hysterical way you laugh when you've just survived something. On the last night, my sister raised her glass and said, "To finding out now," and all 4 of us drank to that. And it felt like the first real toast of the week, more honest than any toast I'd planned for the actual wedding. It's been 8 months since then. Daniel has reached out twice, both times with some version of, "I know I don't deserve it, but can we talk?" I haven't answered either message. Emily posted, a few months ago, something vague about growth and owning your mistakes, which a mutual friend screenshot and sent me, half outraged on my behalf. I didn't feel much of anything reading it, honestly, which surprised me more than the original Betrayal did. I think that's what healing quietly looks like sometimes, not a dramatic moment of forgiveness or fury, just a slow fading of how much power someone's name still has over your day. I went back to therapy about a month after everything happened, mostly at my sister's insistence. A lot of the early sessions were spent picking apart my own instinct to blame myself for not noticing sooner, for trusting too easily, for building an entire future around two people who turned out to be capable of this. My therapist pointed out something that took me a long time to actually believe. The fact that I didn't see it coming wasn't a failure of my judgment. It was evidence that two people who loved me were very good at lying, which is a very different thing, and not something I needed to carry as my own failure. Some sessions were harder than others. There was one, a few months in, where I finally admitted out loud that part of what hurt most wasn't even the affair itself. It was losing Emily specifically. Losing a friendship I'd assumed was as solid as anything in my life. Daniel, in some ways, I could file under romantic relationships end, sometimes badly. Losing a decade of friendship to the same betrayal felt like it broke something I didn't have a category for yet. My therapist didn't try to minimize that or rush me past it. She just let me sit with the fact that grief doesn't rank its losses neatly, and that it was allowed to hurt in ways that didn't match the main storyline of the breakup. I've also had to rebuild my sense of what trust actually feels like in new friendships, which has been slower going than I expected. I catch myself, sometimes, watching for the version of quietness Emily had in those last 2 months, reading too much into a friend canceling plans or seeming distracted. I'm working on not doing that, on letting new people I'm distrust instead of assuming they're capable of it by default. It's a slow project. I think it might always be a slow project, honestly, and I've made peace with that being part of what this cost me. I also know now that Daniel and Emily weren't some cartoonish villains scheming from day one. That's almost never how these things actually work. It started, from what I've pieced together, as something smaller and more deniable, a vulnerable conversation during a hard week, a line neither of them meant to cross that they crossed anyway, and then a slow, cowardly slide into hiding it rather than facing what they'd done. That doesn't excuse either of them, but understanding the shape of how it happened, instead of only being furious at the fact that it happened, is what actually let me stop replaying it on a loop. I don't know if Daniel and Emily are together now. I've stopped asking mutual friends, mostly because I noticed I felt lighter every week I didn't know. What I do know is that I still have the dress, still zipped in its garment bag, and I haven't decided yet whether to sell it, donate it, or just let it hang there as a strange, private monument to the version of my life I almost walked into. Some nights I open the closet just to look at it, not with sadness exactly, more with a kind of distant curiosity, like looking at a photo of a stranger who happens to share your face. Maybe I'll decide what to do with it this year. Maybe I won't need to decide anything about it at all, and that in itself will be its own kind of answer, proof that I've built a life sturdy enough not to need closure on every single loose end from the one that fell apart. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take away, it's this: trust your instincts even when they are inconvenient. Every strange feeling I brushed aside in those final months, Emily's quietness, Daniel's phone habits, that flicker in a toast, turned out to be real information my body had already picked up on long before my mind caught up. I don't say that to encourage anyone to spiral into suspicion over nothing. I say it because I spent months afterward wishing I'd simply asked one direct question earlier, instead of assuming the people closest to me couldn't possibly be capable of this. They were. And now I know that anyone can be, which is a hard thing to carry, but an even harder thing to keep pretending isn't true. These days, my life looks smaller in some ways and much bigger in others. Smaller, because the group of people I trust completely has narrowed considerably, and I'm careful now about who gets access to the parts of my life that matter most. Bigger, because the trust one do extend feels more solid for having survived something that tested it. I'm not bitter, most days. I'm just more awake than I used to be, and I think that's a fair trade for what it cost me to get here.